October 1943. Sergeant Klaus Brandt bit into something he hadn't tasted in 4 years, and for a moment, he forgot he was a prisoner. The sweetness exploded across his tongue, rich and smooth and impossibly real. His hands trembled as he stared at the brown wrapper in disbelief. American chocolate! Not the bitter, waxy substitute that German factories had been producing since 1940. Real chocolate. The kind his grandmother used to smuggle to him before the war. The kind that had vanished from Europe like a pleasant dream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Around him, 24 German soldiers stood frozen in the Oklahoma dirt, each holding an identical bar. Some were crying. Others laughed with a sound that bordered on hysteria. A few simply sat down where they stood, overwhelmed by something as simple as candy. They had surrendered 3 weeks ago in Italy, expecting execution or starvation. Instead, they had just received rations that included more chocolate than most German civilians had seen since 1939. This wasn't charity. This wasn't special treatment. The American corporal distributing supplies explained with casual indifference that every single American soldier received the same rations. 50 million chocolate bars were being produced each month. Not for officers, not for the elite, for everyone, including enemies. Sergeant Brandt had joined the Wehrmacht in 1938, a true believer in the promises of strength and glory. He had fought in Poland, France, and North Africa. He had watched his country conquer half of Europe. He had been taught that Germany represented the peak of civilization, that their enemies were weak and decadent, crumbling from within. Now he stood in a prison camp in Middle America, holding proof that everything he'd been told was a fabrication. The chocolate came from Hershey, Pennsylvania, a town that produced more chocolate in a single day than the entire German confectionery industry managed in a month. The American Guard spoke about it casually, mentioning that the company had converted its entire operation to military production. They made a special formula that wouldn't melt in tropical heat, designed specifically so soldiers could carry sweetness into battle. The factory employed thousands of workers, running 3 shifts around the clock, turning out rations at a pace that seemed impossible. Private Ernst Weber, a baker's son from Munich, understood food production. He had worked in his father's shop since childhood, knew the cost of ingredients, the scarcity of sugar, the impossibility of obtaining quality cocoa. He did the mathematics in his head and couldn't make the numbers work. The amount of sugar alone required for 50 million chocolate bars exceeded Germany's entire monthly civilian allocation. And this was just one item, just one company, in a nation that seemed to produce everything in quantities that defied reason. That first night in the camp, Weber couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the chocolate, about what it represented. In Germany, sugar had been rationed since the 2nd month of the war. Butter was a memory. Coffee had become a cruel joke, replaced by roasted grain that tasted like burnt dirt. His mother's letters described waiting in lines for hours to receive a small portion of bread. His sister had written about a black market where a single egg cost a day's wages. Yet here, in this prison camp, enemy soldiers received chocolate as casually as if it were air. The morning brought fresh revelations. Breakfast included eggs, genuine coffee, white bread with butter, and small packets of jam. Each prisoner received portions that exceeded what German soldiers at the front were getting. The coffee alone represented a luxury that had disappeared from German life years ago. Weber watched American guards pour themselves 2nd and 3rd cups, drinking it black or with fresh cream, treating it as mundane as water. Corporal Heinrich Fischer from Hamburg had been a merchant before the war. He understood economics, supply chains, the brutal mathematics of scarcity. What he witnessed in that Oklahoma camp violated every principle he thought he understood. The Americans weren't just feeding prisoners well, they were feeding them carelessly, abundantly, with a waste that seemed almost offensive. He watched kitchen staff scrape half-full bowls of oatmeal into garbage bins. He saw entire loaves of bread discarded because they were a day old. He witnessed coffee poured down drains because it had sat too long and cooled. This wasn't cruelty or mockery. The Americans simply had so much that waste meant nothing. They operated from a baseline of such profound abundance that scarcity didn't exist as a concept. Fisher started keeping notes, trying to quantify what he was seeing. Each prisoner received approximately 4,000 calories daily. German civilians were surviving on 1,200. The chocolate bars alone provided more sugar than a German family saw in a week. The meat portions at dinner exceeded monthly rations back home. He filled pages with calculations, trying to understand an economy that could afford to be this generous to enemies. The camp itself told a story of industrial capacity that seemed like fantasy. It had been constructed in less than 3 months, yet featured wooden barracks that used more lumber than entire German villages possessed. Each building had electric heating, indoor plumbing, and windows with real glass. The infirmary stocked medicines that German military hospitals couldn't obtain. The recreation hall had a piano, books in German, and a radio that prisoners were allowed to use. Lieutenant Otto Zimmermann, a career officer from an old Prussian family, found the radio the most disturbing element. In Germany, unauthorized radio listening meant death. The government controlled all information, filtered all news, shaped all narratives. Here, in a prison camp, enemy soldiers could tune in to whatever stations they wanted. The morning brought fresh revelations. Breakfast included eggs, genuine coffee, white bread with butter, and small packets of jam. Each prisoner received portions that exceeded what German soldiers at the front were getting. The coffee alone represented a luxury that had disappeared from German life years ago. Weber watched American guards pour themselves second and third cups, drinking it black or with fresh cream, treating it as mundane as water. Corporal Heinrich Fischer from Hamburg had been a merchant before the war. He understood economics, supply chains, the brutal mathematics of scarcity. What he witnessed in that Oklahoma camp violated every principle he thought he understood. The Americans weren't just feeding prisoners well, they were feeding them carelessly, abundantly, with a waste that seemed almost offensive. He watched kitchen staff scrape half-full bowls of oatmeal into garbage bins. He saw entire loaves of bread discarded because they were a day old. He witnessed coffee poured down drains because it had sat too long and cooled. This wasn't cruelty or mockery. The Americans simply had so much that waste meant nothing. They operated from a baseline of such profound abundance that scarcity didn't exist as a concept. Fisher started keeping notes, trying to quantify what he was seeing. Each prisoner received approximately 4,000 calories daily. German civilians were surviving on 1,200. The chocolate bars alone provided more sugar than a German family saw in a week. The meat portions at dinner exceeded monthly rations back home. He filled pages with calculations, trying to understand an economy that could afford to be this generous to enemies. The camp itself told a story of industrial capacity that seemed like fantasy. It had been constructed in less than 3 months, yet featured wooden barracks that used more lumber than entire German villages possessed. Each building had electric heating, indoor plumbing, and windows with real glass. The infirmary stocked medicines that German military hospitals couldn't obtain. The recreation hall had a piano, books in German, and a radio that prisoners were allowed to use. Lieutenant Otto Zimmermann, a career officer from an old Prussian family, found the radio the most disturbing element. In Germany, unauthorized radio listening meant death. The government controlled all information, filtered all news, shaped all narratives. Here, in a prison camp, enemy soldiers could tune in to whatever stations they wanted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. They could hear American news reports that openly discussed military setbacks. They could listen to commentary that criticized government decisions. They could access information that German citizens had been denied for a decade. Zimmermann spent hours by that radio, listening with growing horror to the casual freedom of American media. Reporters questioned military strategy. Commentators debated policy. Citizens called in to argue with elected officials. This wasn't propaganda. This was chaos. And somehow, impossibly, it was making America stronger rather than tearing it apart. But it was the chocolate that kept returning to haunt them. That small brown bar represented something larger than sweetness or calories. It was proof of an industrial machine so vast, so efficient, so utterly dominant that it could afford to give luxury items to prisoners while fighting a war on 2 continents. Private Josef Keller had worked in a chocolate factory in Berlin before conscription. He knew the process intimately, from cocoa processing to final wrapping. He understood the infrastructure required, the supply chains needed, the sheer volume of raw materials involved. One day, he explained it to a group of prisoners, his voice growing quieter as the implications sank in. To produce 50 million chocolate bars monthly required transport ships bringing cocoa from South America and Africa. It required sugar refineries processing tons of cane. It required dairy farms supplying milk. It required factories with specialized equipment. It required workers, thousands of them, dedicated to nothing but making candy for soldiers. And this was happening while America simultaneously built ships, planes, tanks, and weapons at a rate that exceeded all Axis production combined. The mathematical reality was crushing. Germany was being outproduced in every category by margins so vast they seemed absurd. For every tank Germany built, America built 5. For every plane, 10. For every ship, 20. And they were doing it while maintaining a civilian standard of living that exceeded German peacetime prosperity. Week 2 in the camp brought work assignments. Prisoners were sent to local farms and factories to address labor shortages. This was when the true scale of American capacity became undeniable. Brandt found himself assigned to a food processing plant in a town whose name he couldn't pronounce. What he saw there destroyed the last remnants of his faith in German superiority. The plant processed vegetables for military rations. Conveyor belts moved continuously, carrying tons of produce through automated cleaning, cutting, and canning systems. Machines did the work of hundreds of men. A single supervisor could monitor an entire production line using electrical controls. The facility operated around the clock, 3 shifts of workers who arrived in their own automobiles, parked in lots larger than most German town squares. The shift supervisor, a woman in her 50s, explained the operation with pride. They processed enough vegetables daily to feed an entire division. The plant was one of 40 identical facilities across the Midwest. Together, they ensured American soldiers ate fresh vegetables even in the middle of Pacific jungles or North African deserts. She mentioned casually that they often had to destroy excess production because they made more than the military needed. Brandt watched them bulldoze mountains of perfectly good tomatoes into pits because market prices had dropped. He watched them discard entire batches of green beans for minor discoloration. He watched abundance become waste, wealth become garbage, all because there was simply too much. That night, back in the barracks, he tried to write a letter home. How could he explain what he'd seen? How could he tell his wife, starving in a bombed-out Berlin apartment, that he'd watched Americans throw away more food in one day than their neighborhood saw in a month? How could he describe machines that did impossible work, wealth so vast it became careless, an industrial capacity that seemed to violate the laws of economics? He settled for lies. He wrote that he was well, that the Americans treated prisoners fairly, that he hoped to see her soon. He didn't mention the chocolate. He didn't mention the waste. He didn't mention the creeping realization that Germany had challenged something it never should have provoked. Fisher was assigned to a factory that manufactured boots. He spent his days in a facility that produced more footwear in a week than German factories managed in a year. Everything was mechanized, streamlined, optimized for speed and volume. Leather moved on conveyor systems. Machines cut and stitched with precision that human hands couldn't match. Quality control inspectors rejected boots for flaws so minor that German soldiers would have considered them perfect. The factory manager gave prisoners a tour, explaining the production process with enthusiasm. He pointed out innovations, efficiency improvements, and technological advantages. He mentioned that this was a medium-sized facility, that larger plants existed in other cities, that American industry was just getting started ramping up for war production. Fisher did calculations in his head. This one factory, in a city he'd never heard of, outproduced the entire German boot manufacturing sector. And it was considered medium-sized. The numbers suggested an industrial capacity so vast that Germany never had a chance. The war wasn't a contest. It was a mismatch so profound that the outcome had been predetermined the moment America entered the conflict. Weber ended up at a bakery, supplying military rations. The owner, a German immigrant who'd left Bavaria in 1925, spoke to him in their shared language. The old man had no sympathy for the Nazi cause, but he felt some kinship with these young prisoners. Over coffee, real coffee with real cream, he explained what they were seeing. America hadn't mobilized yet, not really. The country was still operating at partial capacity, still converting peacetime production to military needs, still ramping up. What the prisoners saw as overwhelming abundance was just the beginning. Factories were expanding, new facilities were being built, production targets kept being revised upward. And somehow, impossibly, American civilians were still living better than European aristocracy had before the war. The baker pulled out production figures, showing Weber the numbers in black and white. American wheat production alone exceeded all of Europe's combined output. A single Midwestern state grew more grain than Germany imported annually. The country produced so much food that the challenge wasn't scarcity but managing surplus, controlling prices, finding ways to utilize abundance. Weber thought about the chocolate bars. He thought about the casual waste. He thought about kitchens throwing away bread because it was a day old. He thought about his mother's letters describing starvation, about his sister trading family heirlooms for potatoes, about a nation that had conquered half a continent yet couldn't feed its own people. That night, he wrote in his journal, trying to process the cognitive dissonance. They had been told America was weak, divided, corrupted by democracy and diversity. They had been promised that German discipline and unity would overcome American softness. They had believed that willpower and racial superiority mattered more than industrial capacity. Every chocolate bar proved that those promises were lies. By the third week, something was shifting in the camp. Prisoners who had arrived as convinced Nazis were asking questions. They wanted to understand how democracy worked. They wanted to know how America achieved such prosperity. They wanted to learn why freedom seemed to create strength rather than weakness. The camp commander, a colonel who'd taught political science before the war, started evening discussion sessions. He didn't push propaganda. He didn't lecture or indoctrinate. He simply answered questions, explaining American government, economics, and society with the patience of a teacher. Prisoners filled the recreation hall, hungry for information that contradicted everything they'd been taught. Zimmerman attended every session. He asked about constitutional limits on government power, about freedom of the press, about how democracy could function without descending into chaos. The colonel's answers challenged assumptions that Zimmerman had held his entire adult life. Government existed to serve citizens, not control them. Freedom created innovation rather than disorder. Diversity brought strength through different perspectives and skills. The chocolate kept appearing in weekly rations. That small luxury became a symbol, a reminder, a constant proof of everything they were learning. Every time Brandt bit into that smooth sweetness, he remembered his grandmother's stories of better times, of a Germany before hatred and conquest, of a world where chocolate was normal rather than miraculous. He started thinking about after the war, about what kind of country Germany could become, about whether the lessons learned in an Oklahoma prison camp could be carried home and planted like seeds in burned soil, about whether defeat might actually be the beginning of something better than the victory they'd been promised. The chocolate tasted like hope, strange, unexpected, almost unwelcome hope, that maybe everything they'd lost wasn't gone forever. Maybe what they were seeing here, this casual abundance and confident freedom, could somehow be replicated in the ruins of the Reich. But that transformation was still weeks away. For now, they were still processing shock, still trying to reconcile what they'd been told with what they could see and taste and touch. The chocolate bars kept coming, every week,
impossibly sweet, each one a small brown messenger carrying news that their entire world had been built on lies. November arrived with cold winds across the Oklahoma plains, and with it came something that shattered what remained of German prisoners' understanding of their enemies. Thanksgiving preparations began in the camp, and the kitchen staff explained that prisoners would receive the same holiday meal as American soldiers worldwide. Turkey, with all the traditional accompaniments, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes with gravy, stuffing, pumpkin pie, and of course, chocolate in multiple forms, from pudding to candy to cake frosting. Fisher couldn't process the information. Enemy soldiers, men who had killed Americans months ago, were going to be fed a feast that exceeded anything German officers enjoyed. The cognitive dissonance was so severe that several prisoners insisted it must be propaganda, some elaborate deception designed to weaken their resolve. They would believe it when they saw it, and not a moment before. Thanksgiving Day proved them wrong in the most overwhelming way possible. The mess hall tables were decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves, ridiculous, cheerful touches that seemed obscene to men whose homeland was burning. Then the food arrived, platter after platter of it, quantities so vast that prisoners stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Each man received portions that would have fed a German family for days. The turkey alone, succulent and perfectly roasted, came in slices thicker than Brant had seen since childhood Christmas dinners. Mountains of mashed potatoes, rivers of rich brown gravy, vegetables prepared with butter and care. The pumpkin pie arrived with real whipped cream, impossibly light and sweet. And scattered across every table were bowls of chocolate candies, available for anyone who wanted them, unlimited and casual. Weber ate mechanically at first, his mind unable to process the sensory overload. The flavors were almost painful in their richness after years of bland rations and ersatz substitutes. Halfway through the meal, he put down his fork and simply stared at his plate, tears running down his face. Around him, grown men were weeping openly, overwhelmed by kindness they didn't deserve, by abundance they couldn't understand, by the crushing realization that they had fought for the wrong side. An American chaplain moved through the hall, speaking German with a heavy accent. He explained that Thanksgiving was about gratitude, about recognizing blessings, about sharing abundance with others. He said that Americans believed everyone deserved a good meal, even enemies, because that's what civilization meant. The words were simple, almost naive, yet they carried a weight that sophisticated propaganda never could. Zimmerman sat at a corner table, methodically eating while his mind raced through implications. This wasn't strategic. Feeding prisoners lavish holiday meals didn't advance military objectives.
It didn't weaken German resolve or gather intelligence. It was pure expression of values, a demonstration of principles so deeply held that they extended even to those who had tried to destroy everything America represented. He thought about the chocolate bars in his pocket, the ones from last week's rations that he'd been saving. He thought about the casual waste he'd witnessed, the overflowing abundance, the careless generosity. He thought about his own country, where resources were hoarded, where scarcity was weaponized, where even loyal citizens starved while party leaders feasted. The contrast wasn't just economic. It was moral, philosophical, a fundamental difference in how societies treated human beings. After dinner, the camp commander announced that prisoners could listen to radio broadcasts from home. The International Red Cross had arranged for messages from German families to be transmitted through neutral channels. Men crowded around the radio, desperate for news, hungry for connection to the world they'd left behind. What they heard destroyed them more thoroughly than any battle could have. Their families were starving. Cities were being bombed into rubble. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Atlantic Wall was crumbling. The 1,000-year Reich was dying in its 12th year, and everyone back home knew it. Women and children were fleeing westward, ahead of Soviet armies. Old men and boys were being conscripted for hopeless last stands. The chocolate in their pockets suddenly tasted like ash and guilt. Keller received a message from his wife. Their apartment building had been destroyed in an RAF raid. She was living in a basement with their 2 children, surviving on potato peels and hope. She didn't blame him for being captured. She was grateful he was alive, grateful he was safe, grateful he wasn't dying in some frozen trench in Russia. Her voice cracked as she said she loved him, that she was proud of him, that she prayed for his return. He sat in the dark barracks that night, holding a chocolate bar, thinking about his children who were starving while he grew fat on enemy generosity. The injustice of it consumed him. He hadn't done anything to deserve this comfort. He had fought for evil, believed in lies, enabled atrocities. Yet here he was, warm and fed and safe, while innocent people suffered for the crimes his generation had committed. The following week, prisoners were taken on a work detail to a nearby town. They were needed at a canning factory that was behind on production quotas. The journey itself provided education that no propaganda could match. They traveled on paved roads that stretched to the horizon, passing farms with modern equipment, towns with electricity and running water, schools and churches and shops filled with goods. The factory manager was a woman named Margaret Sullivan, a widow whose husband had died at Guadalcanal. She had every reason to hate Germans, yet she treated the prisoners with professional courtesy, explaining work assignments with patience and clarity. She mentioned casually that the factory had been built in 4 months, a timeline that seemed impossible for the scale of the facility. The production line processed tomatoes into various products: soup, sauce, paste, juice. Conveyor systems moved fruit through automated washing, sorting, and cooking equipment. Quality control was maintained by instruments rather than human judgment. Output numbers appeared on electrical boards, tracking production in real time. A single shift produced more processed tomatoes than German factories managed in a month. During the lunch break, Mrs. Sullivan sat with the prisoners in the cafeteria. She brought out photographs of her husband, showed them his smile, told them about his dreams of opening a hardware store after the war. She wasn't trying to make them feel guilty. She was simply sharing her life, treating them as human beings rather than enemies. Then she handed out chocolate bars from the vending machine, explaining that workers could buy them any time for 5 cents. Fisher asked the question that had been haunting him for weeks. How did America produce so much? What was the secret? Was it the land, the resources, the geography? Mrs. Sullivan considered the question seriously, then gave an answer that changed how Fisher understood everything. America produced abundance because workers were free, she explained. They could choose their jobs, negotiate their wages, move between companies seeking better opportunities. Innovation was rewarded. Efficiency was celebrated. Success created wealth that was shared through wages and benefits. The system wasn't perfect, but it unleashed human potential in ways that controlled economies never could. People worked harder when they worked for themselves rather than for distant authorities who didn't care about their welfare. She gestured at the factory around them. Every improvement in productivity meant better wages for workers. Every innovation in processing meant lower costs for consumers. Every efficiency gain meant more profit that could be invested in expansion and equipment. The cycle fed itself, creating prosperity that seemed to defy economic laws. It wasn't magic. It was freedom translating into productivity, democracy creating abundance, human dignity generating wealth. The prisoners returned to camp that evening carrying more than just tired bodies. They carried understanding that challenged everything their education had taught them. Germany had pursued conquest to gain resources it lacked. America had resources because it had built a system that encouraged their creation. The fundamental assumptions had been reversed. Strength didn't come from domination. It came from liberation. December brought another revelation that left prisoners struggling with contradictions they couldn't resolve. Christmas preparations began in camp, and local churches announced they would be sending gifts to German prisoners.
Not just packages of necessities, but actual Christmas presents, wrapped and decorated, containing luxuries and comforts. The first delivery arrived on December 10th. Hundreds of boxes, each labeled with a prisoner's name, each filled with items chosen specifically for individuals based on information from Red Cross interviews. Keller received art supplies because he'd mentioned sketching in his letters home.
Weber got baking equipment because someone remembered his trade. Brandt found a warm scarf knitted by hand, along with a note from the woman who'd made it, wishing him peace and safety. Every box contained chocolate. Not just rations, but premium chocolates in decorative tins, the kind that German aristocrats gave as expensive gifts before the war. Small cards explained that these were donations from church communities, from civic organizations, from school children who'd collected money to buy presents for enemy soldiers spending Christmas far from home. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't government initiatives or propaganda efforts. These were ordinary Americans, many of whom had sons fighting Germans, choosing to show kindness to enemies. The gesture wasn't strategic or calculated. It was pure human decency, extended even to those who didn't deserve it, because that's what the holiday meant to people who took their values seriously. Zimmerman organized a meeting in the recreation hall that night. 40 prisoners gathered, men from different units and backgrounds, united by confusion and growing transformation. They needed to understand what they were experiencing, needed to process revelations that challenged their core identities. One young private, barely 20 years old, asked the question everyone was thinking. Why were Americans being so kind? What did they gain from it? Was it weakness or strength? Zimmerman, drawing on his discussions with the camp commander, tried to explain what he was beginning to understand. American kindness came from confidence, he said. Only the truly powerful could afford to be generous to enemies. Only those certain of victory could treat opponents with dignity. The chocolate, the gifts, the abundant meals, these weren't signs of weakness. They were demonstrations of strength so overwhelming that America didn't need to prove anything through cruelty. The nation could afford to show mercy because it had already won. But it was deeper than that, he continued. Americans genuinely believed that all people had value, that even enemies deserved basic human treatment. They had built a society on principles rather than power, on ideas rather than force. Those principles made them strong precisely because they attracted loyalty and inspired effort. People fought harder for freedom than for conquest, worked harder for themselves than for dictators, sacrificed more for shared ideals than for imposed authority. The chocolate represented that philosophy in edible form. It was unnecessary, a luxury, something that purely utilitarian thinking would eliminate from military rations. But Americans understood that morale mattered, that small comforts sustained spirits, that treating soldiers well made them more effective. So they produced 50 million chocolate bars monthly, ensuring that every man in uniform, no matter how far from home, received a taste of sweetness to remind him what he was fighting for. Christmas Day exceeded Thanksgiving's generosity. The feast included ham, turkey, potatoes prepared 3 different ways, vegetables in butter sauce, fresh bread with real butter, multiple desserts including chocolate cake with chocolate frosting, and bowls of assorted candies at every table. Local families had donated homemade cookies and pies, adding personal touches to institutional abundance. After dinner, a church choir came to sing carols in German. They performed traditional songs that prisoners remembered from childhood. Melodies that carried memories of better times, lyrics that spoke of peace and hope and redemption. Women who had lost sons to German bullets sang about forgiveness and brotherhood. Men whose brothers had died in Europe harmonized about love transcending hatred. The incongruity was almost unbearable. Weber broke during Silent Night. The combination of familiar melody, overwhelming kindness, and crushing guilt finally shattered his ability to maintain composure. He sobbed like a child, mourning everything his nation had become, everything it had destroyed, everyone it had killed. Around him, dozens of prisoners were experiencing the same collapse, the same moral reckoning, the same devastating realization that they had fought for monsters. The weeks after Christmas brought intensive education programs. University professors came to camp, offering classes in English, American history, democratic government, and economics. These weren't mandatory propaganda sessions. They were genuine educational opportunities, provided to enemies at university level, taught by qualified instructors who treated students with respect. Fisher enrolled in every class he could access. He studied the American Constitution with the same intensity he'd once devoted to military tactics. He learned about separation of powers, checks and balances, individual rights protected from government intrusion. He studied the Bill of Rights, amazed that a government would formally limit its own authority. He examined federalism, understanding how distributed power prevented tyranny. The economic classes revealed why America produced such abundance. Professor Henderson from the State University explained market systems, competition driving innovation, profit incentives encouraging efficiency, private property rights protecting investment. He contrasted it with planned economies, where bureaucrats made decisions without market feedback, where lack of competition removed incentives for improvement, where absence of private property eliminated motivation for innovation. Henderson used concrete examples. The chocolate bars they received came from companies competing for military contracts. Hershey wasn't the only producer. Mars, Nestle, and others also supplied rations. Companies competed on price, quality, and reliability. That competition drove continuous improvement. Military planners chose the best products at the best prices. Taxpayers got maximum value. Soldiers got superior supplies. In planned economies, Henderson explained, a single state factory would have a monopoly. Without competition, there'd be no pressure to improve. Without profit motive, there'd be no incentive to innovate. Without private ownership, there'd be no pride in product quality. The result would be expensive, inferior chocolate produced inefficiently by workers who had no reason to care about outcomes. The lesson went beyond chocolate. It explained why American factories outproduced German ones despite Germany's vaunted efficiency.
It explained why American workers with freedom and incentives accomplished more than German workers under control and coercion. It explained why democracy, despite appearing chaotic and inefficient, actually generated better results than dictatorship. Brandt studied American history, learning about a nation built by people fleeing exactly the kind of authoritarian government Germany had embraced. He read about immigrants from dozens of countries, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, maintaining different customs, yet somehow forging a unified nation from diversity. The Nazi ideology that claimed homogeneity created strength was contradicted by American evidence that diversity brought innovation, resilience, and power. He learned about American mistakes and failures: slavery, Indian removal, discrimination, corruption, all the dark chapters that Americans themselves acknowledged and tried to address. The candor was shocking. In Germany, admitting national failures meant imprisonment or death. In America, self-criticism was considered healthy, a necessary part of improvement and progress. The winter months brought news that made education both more urgent and more painful. The Reich was collapsing. Soviet armies were pushing toward Berlin. Allied forces were crossing into Germany proper. Cities were being destroyed. Millions were displaced. The end was approaching, and it would be brutal and complete. Prisoners received letters describing apocalyptic conditions. Keller's wife wrote about fleeing Berlin with their children, walking west through snow, sleeping in ruins, surviving on whatever they could find. She didn't mention food because there wasn't any. She didn't complain about hardship because complaints served no purpose. She only asked if he was alive, if he was safe, if there was any hope for a future. He sat in the warm barracks, belly full of dinner that had included chocolate pudding for dessert, reading about his family's desperate flight, and felt shame so profound it was physically painful. Every comfort he enjoyed was paid for by innocents suffering for his generation's crimes. Every chocolate bar mocked the starvation of those he loved. Every warm night contradicted the frozen hell his countrymen endured. Yet alongside shame came growing determination. If Germany survived, if anything could be salvaged from the ruins, it would need people who understood what they'd witnessed in American captivity. It would need citizens who'd seen democracy function, who'd experienced freedom's power, who learned that prosperity came from human dignity rather than conquest. The chocolate bars became symbols of that mission. Brandt started saving wrappers, keeping them in a careful collection. Each one represented a lesson learned, a revelation experienced, an assumption shattered. He planned to take them home, to show his children what American industrial capacity produced, to teach future generations about the society that had defeated them through abundance rather than just arms. February 1945 brought the liberation of concentration camps, and with it came the final moral collapse of any remaining Nazi sympathizers. The camp commander ordered mandatory viewing of footage showing the horrors discovered by Allied troops: mountains of corpses, living skeletons, gas chambers, crematoria, industrial murder conducted with German efficiency applied to humanity's darkest purpose. Some prisoners refused to believe it was real. They called it propaganda, staged photography, Allied lies designed to justify their own crimes, but evidence kept accumulating. Letters from home confirmed the camp's existence. German civilians admitted knowledge of atrocities. The footage was too extensive, too detailed, too horrifically consistent to be fabricated. Weber watched the films and felt his soul die. He had fought for this. He had enabled this. He had believed in the ideology that produced this. His hands were clean, but his uniform was not. His conscience was troubled, but his nation was guilty. He had known something was wrong, had felt uncomfortable with certain policies, had heard disturbing rumors, but he had chosen to believe they were exaggerations or exceptions. Now he knew the truth. Germany hadn't just lost a war. It had committed crimes so enormous that generations would carry the shame. The chocolate in his pocket, given freely by people whose relatives had died in those camps, felt like an indictment. Americans knew what Germans had done, yet still showed kindness. That generosity was harder to bear than any punishment would have been.